There's feedback. Okay.
I see him.
Okay, I'm going to change this role. Where's feedback? Okay.
Hi, Rodney.
Hi, yeah, for some reason you're not. I'm going to make you a co-host. You're not the co-host. So, good morning, everyone. We're just having a bit of technical difficulty. Just bear with us, and we will start very soon. Sorry about that, Vivek.
All good. I think I'm a co-host now.
Yeah. All right.
Couple of people from Fulbright are coming in. I mean, my Fulbright pals.
And yeah, hopefully. Let's see. We've got a question from Aya. She's presenting today. She's not presenting today. Okay.
No, you're not presenting today. Next week.
Do I need to? Oh, I just wonder. I joined because everyone can see me, right? Is it okay?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
We can hear you. You can
That's
turn
okay.
off your camera. That's okay.
Okay.
Just turn off your camera, and so all the presenters will have. You can be seen, but not. So you can turn off your camera and microphones. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Is Ivan on yet? I haven't seen Ivan yet.
Well, Ivan
He's
might be
coming
a
late.
few minutes late, I think.
Okay, so we tested Tuckbo's PowerPoint already. So
Oh, fantastic. Okay, that's good to hear.
So, you just let me know. I have my remarks, so we can brief remarks, and we can get going.
Okay, do you want to get started, or should we wait another minute or two?
I think we've got 50 in the queue here, so I think we can get started because we have a jam-packed
Okay,
program.
sounds good. Okay, let's go ahead and start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 edition of the Orang Asli Symposium series. The Orang Asli are the indigenous peoples of peninsular Malaysia, and this is about their culture and history, as well as the challenges they face today in a rapidly changing world. My name is Vivek Venkataraman, and I'm one of the hosts of this series. I'm an Orang Asli researcher and a professor of anthropology at the University of Calgary in Canada. This event is being hosted by Keene State College in New Hampshire, which also holds the Orang Asli Archive, a resource for teaching and research on all topics Orang Asli. And my co-host is Rodney Obian, Associate Professor and Head of Special Collections and Archives at Keene State College. So before I go into details of the schedule, let's hear a few brief words from Rodney.
Okay, thank you, Vivek. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Again, my name is Rodney Obian, Associate Professor at Special Collections and Archives at Keene State College in the United States. And I oversee the Orang Asli Archive, the proud host of this symposium. I just wanted to give a very quick welcome and not take up too much time since we have many excellent presenters and presentations to follow. The Orang Asli Archive has been in existence since 2000 at Keene State College, and we are one of the largest research and archival repositories of its kind in the world that's housed at a public institution. Our collections are freely accessible and open to all scholars and researchers interested in studying the Orang Asli. We offer you an open invitation to visit us in Keene, New Hampshire, perhaps preferably in the summertime. And as you can see, I'm dressed for winter. It's about 1 degree Celsius here. For more information about the archive, I'll post our link to our website and our digital collections in the chat. But again, I offer you my warmest welcome and please enjoy the symposium. Turn it over to you. Oh,
the people who are attending, they're not on the screen. We can't see them.
we're in a webinar style, so only the presenters. But
Okay, all
if
right.
they need to be seen, we can provide them with access.
All right.
So over to you, Vivek.
Okay, so I'll just say another word or two here real quick before we start. So this is the second edition of this series that follows the 2020 event, which was called Orang Asli Health and Wellbeing. This occurred across 4 3-hour sessions in November of 2020 and featured talks by experts on Orang Asli health, land rights, ethnography, and history, and attracted nearly 300 people, including many Orang Asli themselves, who participated in the Zoom call or tuned in on Facebook to lend their thoughts. I know I'm not alone in thinking that I was extremely impressed by the quality of the talks and the subsequent discussion, which led to new dialogues and connections and relationships. It showed that there's a strong need and desire for a space to discuss Orang Asli issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. So over the next 2 weeks, we'll be continuing that conversation. Today's theme is Orang Asli culture and land rights, featuring 7 talks by leading experts on these issues. And next week at the same time, we'll have a series of presentations that revolve around health and well-being. Just a quick note about some basic housekeeping. Maybe this doesn't apply anymore, but make sure you're muted when you're not speaking. Participants can feel free to use the chat at any time if you have any questions or issues. And it might be a good idea now to write your name and a brief bio in the chat so that we can start to get to know each other. Each talk is 15 minutes, and that includes time for questions. So presenters have been asked to keep their speaking slots from 10 to 12 minutes. And we do ask you to respect this timeline. Audience members, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat at any time, and we will file it away and hopefully get back to it. And if you're called on to ask your question, you may then unmute yourself at that time. At the end of the talks today, which would be roughly 10 p.m. Malaysia time, we will continue on with discussion. So feel free and please do stick around for that. Thank you again for coming, and I hope you find this a useful seminar series and that you can make some connections with people you would not have otherwise met. So our first speaker today is Lai Tuck Po, researcher based at University Science Malaysia in Penang. Welcome, Tuck Po, and feel free to go ahead and share your screen and get started.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. So this presentation is from an interdisciplinary project that I undertook with biologists and primatologists on batik and gibbons, or as biologists would like to call them small apes. So I'm going to start by talking about a little bit about gibbons and then go into my paper. So there are 2 species of gibbons found in the batik areas, the lar and the siamang. Gibbons are monogamous. They groups consist of 1 adult pair and up to 4 dependent offspring, each of which occupies a territory. So as you can see, they're not huge in number, not naturally anyway. Among the Malaysian primates, gibbons are renowned for their morning vocalizations. Adult pairs, they sing duets, and this is what is most striking about them. So, other than these stereotype songs, which are produced in the mornings, gibbons may also emit what are called pan, alarm calls throughout the day. These may be responses to predators or trespassers like humans, elephants, and so on. According to the Batik, a gibbon may habituate to a Batik camp in the vicinity, but may be frightened off by humans coming close. The purpose of my research is to examine cultural perceptions of the gibbons, uh, especially from the perspective of the Batik. I take my approach roughly from ethnoprimatology, which asserts that, quote unquote, humans and other primates are co participants in shaping shared social and ecological worlds, and rejects the perspective that the human other primate interface is best viewed as a relationship only of conflict and competition. I endorse this approach, however, it is not immediately evident how gibbons and the Batik shape each other's social and ecological worlds. The Batik's gibbons have not been habituated to expect intensive human presence. They are prey, but they are rarely caught. And this is going back all the way to the research of Cook Endicott looking at hunting captures. Only sometimes are juveniles, when they are separated from their parents, brought in as pets. In short, there isn't much direct interaction between Batik and gibbons. There is one context where gibbons and Batik have shared dependence on the forest, and this is in the predation of fruits. Gibbons tend to favor similar kinds of fruits as the Batik and the children, sweet, sour. But with one difference, they avoid fruits that are spiky or have thick skins and tend to use their teeth to just dig in. So, in terms of actual interaction, it occurs, I think, auditorily. When gibbons sing, their songs carry, enclosing performers and audience in a shared space, the forest landscape on which both depend. The IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has identified research on gibbons as a priority action. Perhaps the most serious of the threats to gibbons, which are in the category of endangered, are land circumscription and corresponding fragmentation of the forest. But gibbons are not simply victims of development. They play a crucial and often irreplaceable role in seed dispersal for tropical trees, so that a threat to gibbons is also a threat to the forest. And a threat to the forest is also a threat to the Batik. To start, I should say that Batik are in favor of conservation. Conservation is nothing new to them, although that they might define species and animals and appropriate methods of conserving differently from conservationists. Batik and gibbon ecological niches are roughly similar. They live in a variety of disturbed and fragmented landscapes, and we can see that they are adapting to rapid and escalating threats to the forest margins with observable adjustments in their social and foraging behaviors. I propose that Batik ecological knowledge condenses historical memory of the gibbons. That is the Batik and I, have investigated the distribution of fruit-bearing plants, standing trees, vines, and palms that gibbons eat. Many of these plants do not fruit predictably every year, and they often germinate from gibbon scat or vomit. Batik know the habitats of these trees and vines and whether or not the occurrence has been subject to gibbon intervention, i.e., whether they grew naturally or as a result of gibbon feeding patterns. Batik also make hypotheses based on the spatial distribution. For example, once they pointed out one cluster and then another cluster of plants by the riverside, and then another and another. One of the overhanging trees had been a sleeping tree for siamangs, and those seedlings had germinated from scat. Then the batik pointed out yet more seedlings and saplings growing along the path all the way up the hill. That was the route taken by the siamangs as they traveled to their sleeping tree, they said. From extrapolation, they will know roughly how old a seedling or sapling is based on the memories of fruiting cycles. They correlate the age of seedlings and saplings to the last time they remembered that species coming into fruit, and therefore when the tree would have germinated. Of course, they hasten to say that this method would not work for old trees, say older than 8 to 10 years, unless there are other memories that bring that tree to the fore. Also, there's some overlap with fruits eaten by langurs, which makes it difficult sometimes to identify which are which. So, if it's fresh enough, the batik can test it by smelling the shit. Thinking more broadly, the batik are able to trace not just the age of particular plants, but the roots followed by the gibbons. Uh, as they eat and move, of course, gibbons drop traces wherever they go. And because the batik favor many of the same species of fruits, they can use gibbons, their feeding patterns, and their traces as navigational aids to get to the fruits that they want to harvest. And of course, like the gibbons, batik also drop traces. Both affect the demography of fruit trees. So there's a three-way relationship here: gibbons, the batik, and the fruit trees. Between batik and gibbons, there's a kind of mutualism. If the trees are still standing and in fruit, if batik are in gibbon territories, and if the batik want to harvest those fruits. Assuming all those things to be true, they share the same source of food, which enables similar memories of the landscape. I'm not suggesting that gibbons remember or see the landscape in the same way as the batik. The history of the forest is implicated in all of this. Batik and gibbons share a history of the forest. They help to make it what it is. So they tend to share space, but without corresponding interpenetration between gibbon and human society. Following trends elsewhere, discourse in Malaysia has tended to lump all or most human interactions with endangered species under the rubric of conflict. However, for hunter-gatherers like the batik, the term conflict is obviously inadequate. I've described the relationship rather as mutualism. And obviously, this is a world away from competition and conflict. There are some implications of conservation. For example, the acoustic knowledge of gibbons. In other words, the acoustic knowledge of batik of gibbons. In our interdisciplinary project, we have used the technique of passive acoustic monitoring to estimate population densities of gibbons. The batik have participated in these vocal surveys under the guidance and supervision of Isa, who's not here, a biologist. However, though successful, it is a passive method where the listeners are fixed in one location. So I think there's about 500 meters between each listener, and then they basically, the batik know more about this than I do. Uh, so I think using the term conflict, we tend to reduce all human-animal relations to a binary us versus them. Conservation thus becomes a reactive enterprise where we try to limit human behavior and react when new economic opportunities occur. The fact that we are always bringing in new laws, etc., suggests that it isn't working very well. I suggest rather that we think of conservation like we think of the shared history of gibbons and batik, where ecosystemic relations include humans in a shared space that includes acoustic dynamics. where people are responding aesthetically to what they hear around them. In other words, rather than target species conservation, we think about habitats and the appropriate way to live in them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That was really interesting. I believe I saw a hand raised during your talk. Maybe we can see if that could work for that person to speak. I believe the name was Rita or Rita, perhaps. Rodney, are we able to have participants speak?
I'll have to activate it. So Rita, let's see.
And others can feel free to type in the chat too.
If you can type it. So go ahead, Rita. You're able to, should be able to speak. Or type your question, whatever you prefer.
Okay, well, let's give a moment to see if that works, but if not. Okay, well, while we're waiting on that, there is a question in the Q&A asking, rather than mutualism, isn't the relationship between Batek and gibbons more of predators and prey? Tokpo?
Well, that's what I'm trying to say in my paper, that we avoid such terms as predators and prey. So I guess that's all I can say right now with,
Okay.
you know.
Okay, great. Let's see if, okay, well, I'm sure we'll come back to this as we go along. Thanks, Tukpo. Let's move on to the next talk, and then we can come back to discussing this later. So next up is Ivan Tacey, based at the University of Plymouth. Ivan is giving a talk named Batek Cosmopolitics. Welcome, Ivan. You want to share your screen?
Hi, everyone. Does that work? And can you hear me?
Yes, if you could just enlarge it full screen, that would be great, but we can see. Thank you.
I don't really know how to do that. Where? Does that work?
There should be a little open book icon at the bottom right hand of your PowerPoint screen.
It says it's...
Yeah, I think it looks good. And before you start, Ivan, Tukpo, I'll draw your attention to one comment in the chat about the Song of the Siamang collected by Skeeton Blagden describing hunting Siamang. So maybe you can take a look at that in comments later on in the discussion. So thank you to Claire for that note.
All right.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, great. Go ahead, Ivan. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Great to see everyone here. Rosemary, Jeffrey, Tukpo, and everyone else that's here. Rodney. Sorry, Rodney. Okay, so thanks for inviting me, Vivek. So today I'm going to be talking about Batek cosmopolitics in the early 21st century, which is based upon a book chapter that I've written, which I'm happy to share because obviously I can't cover everything in this talk. So my research is based with both the Batek Day and the Batek Maya, also known as the Batek Tanam, who live on this map down in the, I don't know if I can get pointer, annotate, here we go, down in this region, basically, okay, around here. A lot of what I say is particularly about them, to be honest. Okay, so I've been conducting research with Batek since about 2006, okay? And I particularly focus on groups living on the forest edge. Right, can I move on now? Okay, here we go. So the context, as I'm sure you're well aware, is one of rampant environmental destruction, particularly everywhere around the National Park Taman Negara, or most of that now has been converted to palm oil. There are lots of mines opening up in the area, and you must be aware of the fact that there has been no recognition of Batak land rights by the state or federal government. This is very important. However, Bataks are lucky to a certain degree in Malaysia, as part of their territory is protected by the Taman Negara National Park. Okay, so this is the book that this work's based upon. And in the book's all about what Ribbley, Stewart, Strathern and Torrey called eco-cosmologies, which are basically the concepts and practices relating to the order or arrangement, the term cosmos, of the universe, which are embedded within local ecological systems, the wider environment, and weather systems. And these shape praxis and people's understanding of their proper place in the world. Another term that I'm using in my chapter here is cosmopolitics, which I define in a few slightly different ways, but it's worth to begin with. In a Batak example, it's the politics, if you like, of indigenous cosmologies and shamanic practices. So moving on. Okay, so cosmopolitics, as I define them in this chapter, are the kind of political dimensions of animist relations with non-human others. And it must be said that many approaches to animism in recent years, including kind of neo-structuralist approaches by people like Philippe de Scola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro, are kind of apolitical and to a great degree, historical too. Okay, so my research really tries to historicize animism and show its political dimensions. Bruno Latour, who sadly passed away just last weekend, has written quite a lot about cosmopolitics, as has Isabel Stengers. And both of them kind of define cosmopolitics as an inclusive, more than human politics, which includes all human and non-human entities or phenomena with the capacity for agency. And it must be stated here that they're not particularly concerned by indigenous peoples' cosmopolitics, but cosmopolitics in a much wider sense of the term. Okay, so I mentioned land rights earlier, and this is very important, and I recommend reading Subramaniam and Ido's 2016 article about this topic, which this quote is from here. And in order to assert any rights to their customary lands, Orang Asli claimants must establish that they are a distinct tribal division of the Orang Asli, as characterized by culture, language, social organization. They speak an Orang Asli language and habitually follow an Orang Asli way of life, customs and beliefs. This means that shamans often play vital roles in establishing whether communities observe an Aboriginal way of life and concomitant customs and beliefs, and accordingly can be categorized as Aboriginal for the purposes of a customary land rights claim. And the kind of knowledge which can be termed shamanic or animistic is largely an emplaced and embodied knowledge. And this includes things like myths anchored in local environments, in the Batak Maya's case, particularly mountains, karsts, hills, waterfalls, river bends, and so forth, which are said to have spirits, often said to have spirits residing in landscape features. Also shamanic dream songs obtained from these spirits, histories and myths embedded in landscapes, and observation of customs handed down from creator beings. Okay, so these can all form central aspects of land claims. So why am I saying this? Well, indigenous people to land claims, not just the Bataks, have important cosmopolitical dimensions. And these, I argue, transcend purported ontological differences between indigenous peoples and the state. So rather than seeing kind of the Bataks as having a particular ontology, there being a scientific or capitalist ontology, or each group kind of being bounded in a very similar way as the kind of culture concept has traditionally bounded people in anthropology, I'm interested in how things transcend these differences, okay? So they shouldn't, eco-cosmologies or ontopolitics, or whichever term we're using here, should not be just thought of as aspects of a particular culture, ontology, or worldview. They constitute a form of cosmopolitics or ontopolitics that transcends ontological difference. And that's really an important point. So cosmopolitics in whichever form, I argue, are intrinsically relational. So even its most scientific manifestations many scientists, including and philosophers, including Whitehead, Lynn Margulis, James Lovelock, talk about the kind of mutualistic relations that Tuck Po touched upon in her talk before, where agents act in various forms of association, which could be mutualistic, could be predatory, could be all kinds of different forms, at multiple interlocking scales, from down on the cellular level right up to the planetary or interplanetary scale, okay, and on the local ecological scale of areas of the rainforest, for example. So they're not monolithic and homogenizing. Not all scientists and philosophers are committed to Cartesian or atomistic views of reality, which de Scola kind of lumps them together in his term naturalism. And not all Westerners are enthralled to the kind of business ontology that someone like Mark Fisher would describe. Okay, so let's return to animism now. What I'd like to say is animism is by default cosmopolitical, in that besides humans, a vast array of other living things and phenomena, including animals, plants, thunder, rain, are active agents with the capacity for consciousness and subjectivity, okay? Intentionality and agency. Sorry, I feel like I'm going very fast, but I'm going to give you a few examples now. So here, this is Batu Taboyne, a limestone cast in the Batek Maya area. And in this cast, there's a story about how a couple, an uncle and his niece, committed an act of incest, and they were then punished by the thunder deity, who then killed them. And you can see their blood in these orange marks on the cast here. And so that's myth, if you like, or that creation story is embedded and placed in the landscape. And in my opinion, that should be recognized in similar ways to the Olgas or Uluru in Australia, and recognized as forming this very important landscape, both for its importance for the Batek people, but also, and I can't talk about that today, because of its ecological importance. So there are all kinds of places across Batek Maya and Batek Day landscapes which link times, places, people, spirits, and myths in remarkable cosmotopographies, okay? So another example would be the politics of the thunder deity, known as Kai or Gobar by the Batek, Kai by the Batek Maya, Gobar by the Batek Day. And in my chapter, I talk about the kind of ambiguous associations between the thunder deity, who, when he's kind of calm and in control, he looks like a Malay. But as he loses control, he takes on this more animal-like image, which could be, he could have a tiger's kind of head or an elephant's head or a bear's head. And he becomes ferocious, frightening, vengeful. He causes these storms and the destruction that can result in deaths of people. And I agree to a certain degree with Robert Denton that the thunder deity, to a certain degree, can be seen as an embodiment of the violent slave raiding state. However, his behavior and characteristics is not only incorporation of this external power and violence, it's also a transformation of that power and violence into reproductive potentiality, because he's in charge of, often seen as being in charge of releasing the rains that cause the fruit trees to blossom, and he's closely associated with these processes of fertility. Another example would be the rainbow snake, called Naga or Baji, who's the kind of Gobar's subterranean counterpart, and is seen by many Bateks as being the cause of the 2004 tsunami and the Tohoku earthquake in Japan that occurred in 2011. And many Batek Maya shamans, interestingly, claim to be able to tame the Naga, sorry. Okay, I can't talk about that now because I'm just about out of time. I'm going to skip that example because we just haven't got enough time to look at it. But anyway, another aspect is what we would call Batek futurism, this another kind of cosmopolitics, which is this vision of the future that because of this out of control environmental degradation, this will enrage the Naga and the Thunderlord to such an extent, but particularly the Naga, that the Naga's rocking and writhing will cause a world-ending flood that will engulf the planet. This is something Tuck Po talks about in her book 2004, and I've written about extensively in my research. Alongside that, there's a secondary, more positive future that the kind of Americans or some other powerful outsiders will intervene and protect Bateks from the Malays, end their marginalization, prevent environmental destruction, and establish relations with Batek and other Asli based on equality. So there's two possible futures, which I think is very interesting itself. So to conclude, I've got three main points I'd like to sum up here, and sorry for going over by 2 minutes. These kind of subaltern cosmopolitical strategies that emerge through eclectic blending of different cosmological frameworks and kind of ontological forms coexist at the political margins. Two, as I said earlier, indigenous people do not live in ontological worlds separated by incommensurable difference from other social groups. Pretending they do is inaccurate and misleading. It hampers our understanding of animism and shamanism and results in exoticized representations of indigenous people, which I see again and again at conferences. Okay. Thirdly, Batek eco-cosmologies and cosmopolitics result from these connections and ruptures that alternately entangle and sever ties with various beings and places in the local environment, as well as people and places from the wider world, such as America, Japan, China, and so forth. Right, I've made it to the end. Sorry that I'm slightly longer, Vivek. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Ivan. We're actually doing pretty well on time. I think we started a few minutes early, so that was great. Does anyone have any questions for Ivan Tacey? While people maybe type some things in or think about it, I have one question, Ivan. In your experience, how are younger people in Orang Asli communities dealing with the sorts of changes that you're discussing versus the older people? How are they kind of conceptualizing their world and all these changes without having necessarily a reference point because they're much younger? Can you comment on that at all?
Sure, I think it's a great question, and there's no simple answer, because one example that I give all the time is an example of two friends who you know, okay? One is Alif, who you know very well, and his best friend is a full-time forager living in the forest, okay? Alif now, he works for Hillertown Department of Wildlife and National Parks. His wife is Temia. He's got a house now in Gua Masang. He's got full-time employment with the department, and he's very much kind of modern, if you like, Batek. And he's grown up in Ering Lima and Post-Labir, and has been somewhat dislocated from that full-time forager way of life. However, his friendship with his best friend, who's a full-time forager, endures, and Alif is very much aware of all these problems, and he takes in ideas from the outside world. So depending on individuals' personal experiences, I mean, it changes everything. And furthermore, all these communities that I work in on the forest edge, as you know, are fractured more and more along lines of kind of modernizers, which would include Bateks who have nominally, or perhaps even more than nominally, converted to Islam, and those that carry on more traditional, animistic, foraging ways of life. So I think for the youth in general, it's rather a confused situation, as those who are taken out and put into schools which are run on Malay grounds are kind of told, you know, you have to be good Muslims, you should do this, you should be growing rubber trees, or you should be getting jobs and so forth. And then the older generation, who of course are not going to stop them doing that, but who really talk about these myths and relations with spirits and so forth much more, and have more of this relationship with them. But I think in general, a lot of Batek youth do still have, and they do still take seriously the kind of stories, myths, and practices that I mentioned earlier. But it is a fractured, and it's quite disheartening situation when you see the environmental degradation. And these individuals, even those who, you know, people that have converted to Islam, these are choices. You know, what choices are they actually left with? You know, so it's very, very difficult. Does that help to a certain degree?
Yeah, that's great. It's a very interesting dynamic situation. There are two questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see them, Ivan, but I'll just summarize them. The first is, how do the Batek people perceive the Naga, that is in a good or bad view or otherwise, and then noting the parallels with other indigenous cultures, Australia, Indonesia, etc. And the second question is, as the Orang Asli are increasingly exposed to other religions, such as Christianity and Islam, how do they interpret their beliefs with new religion that they profess? Do they still accept these beliefs or discard them totally? That's a good question, a big one, but Ivan, maybe you can speak to that.
Sure, I'll start with the first one. So no, you've got to forget about these kind of Manichaean good and bad, evil, and good being associated with the upper world, bad below, hell. No, the Naga is not seen as some kind of evil being at all, and nor is Gobar, really. Gobar is, well, he's got this very ambiguous position, and can sometimes get kind of very crazy and angry and vengeful, but at other times very calm and so forth. The Naga is, I think, much more important than Gobar, I believe, and definitely not seen as evil in any way. This is the creator being, you know, the earth resides on the Naga's back. And these castes, another interpretation of them, by the way, is that they are petrified remains of primordial Naga. And the Naga is both seen as one and a multiplicity. I mean, it's more, to tell you the truth, the Naga, I'd say, represents this type of fluctuating lunar-like logic between that's associated with dryness and wetness and so forth, rather than anything concerned with good or evil. But both the Naga and the thunder deity do act as enforcers of the moral order, okay? But they're not associated with good or evil as such like that. I mean, although amongst Batik Maya and to a certain degree Batik Day, you know, Gobar, as I said, is associated with malayness sometimes more than Batikness, but other times he's seen as a kind of protector of Batik too. So it's very ambiguous. Second question about Christianity, Islam. It really depends on different individuals. I think there are definitely some Batik individuals now who, or at least they claim to be real practicing Muslims, but then it's much more complicated. Some people that do claim that, a few years later, when they're like, oh, actually, I don't really take it seriously, Ivan. I'm just doing that because of this. You know, you get material benefit so through being Muslim. Some communities have converted to Christianity too, and I think that's as a means of, once they're recognized as Christians, they can't be converted into Islam. And I don't think people integrate wholesale beliefs in Islam or Christianity. It's much more complicated, but it's extremely difficult, particularly for the youth, when they've been dislocated, particularly amongst Jahai communities. For example, in the village, Jelly village, or the Jelly area, the children, even within the village, are forced to board within an Islamic school in the village itself. So it means they're totally separate during the week from their parents and other adults, and are just forced to listen to Muslim proselytizers. So it's, I mean, that's extremely difficult situation. And of course, being dislocated from the forest and all that way of life that goes with it is very tricky.
Okay, thanks, Ivan. We do have two more questions in the Q&A. Maybe you can take a look at those and consider them for the later discussion.
Sure.
So thanks for that.
Thanks.
So let's move on to the next talk, which is by Loganathan Krishnan from Monash University in Malaysia. Loganathan, are you there and have your PowerPoint ready to share? Fantastic. Yeah, go ahead. And share.
Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Just give me 1 minute. Right. So the title of my paper is Demystifying the Rights and Legal Position of the Aboriginal Community in Malaysia. Some people do ask me, why do I use the word Aboriginal community and not the word indigenous people? Indigenous people is a very widely used terminology, which can include the natives of Sabah and Sarawak, as well as the Malays of Peninsular Malaysia. So therefore, the rightful terminology is, as per the law, is the Aboriginal community, which in Malay will be Orang Asli. And I'm going to look at three things. First is the effect of the laws on this community, and that is from the Aboriginal Peoples Act 1954, which was passed before the Malaysian independence in 1957, a product of the British colonialism. And moving on to how the courts have come to rescue, to look into the rights of the Aboriginal community, and whether it was successful and the extent it was successful. And finally, I will look at the reforms that could be made. Otherwise, this community is going to be continuing to be vulnerable, not only because of the Aboriginal Peoples Act, but also because of the policies which is undertaken by the government. So this is the legislation I'm referring to, which was passed in 1954. As some of you all are aware that Malaysia achieved independence in 1957. The main objective of the British enacting this law is not really because to protect the Aboriginal community, is to classify them into a group so that they will not be affected by the communist during the pre-independence era. And what the Aboriginal Peoples Act 1954 has done, it has defined who is an Aboriginal community. It has explained what is an Aboriginal way of life. It has also mentioned as to how this community is to be categorized and classified. And these are some of the works people have done as to understand the lifestyle of the Aboriginal community, which is they share their hunting products, they practice shifting cultivation, they collect natural and forest resources, and most importantly, fundamentally, they have a very deep relationship with land, simply because they have their ancestral graveyard within that piece of land. And the problem in Malaysia is that it is a federation, so land is a state matter, and whereas the welfare of the Aboriginal community is a federal matter. So there are times where the federal government would want to expand or would want to protect the rights of the Aboriginal community, but that will depend very much on the land which they are inhabiting. But land is a state matter, and there are some states which are very developed and they wish to develop and they want to get rid of the Aboriginal community, and the Aboriginal community will have to move from one place to another. For those who have been to Malaysia, you may not realize, or you may know, that the KLIA airport is actually on a piece of is a land which belongs to the Aboriginal community, and same goes for the Bangi Golf Resort. In fact, University Kebangsaan Malaysia was also on a piece of land which belonged to the Aboriginal community at one point of time. And some of the works which has been done in the past talks about how the community is losing rights over the land and how the Aboriginal Peoples Act, whereby on one hand, it seems as if it is protecting the rights, but on the other hand, it is severing their entitlement. And scholars have found that this Aboriginal Peoples Act is certainly causing a disadvantage status to the Aboriginal community. And these are some of the excerpts I have taken, voices from the community itself. For example, Ridwan, he says, although we have lived for generations in an area, it is still not considered as ours. And Majid, who is the president of POSAM. POSAM is an organization which represents the interests of the Aboriginal community. Of course, now they have a new name. He said that you take away our land, you take away our spirits, and you usurp our will. And also Majid says that guarantee us tenure of our lands and everything else will fall into place. Very interestingly, Senin, an Aboriginal person, said, if the urban people depend on education for their livelihood, we, as in the Aboriginal community, depend very much on land. Now, these are some of the most shocking shocking interpretation of the Aboriginal Peoples Act. If you look at Section 6, subsection 3, although 6, subsection 1 says land can be gazetted, 6, subsection 3 says it can be degazetted. So it's a double-edged sword. And Section 8, subsection 2 says they do not have ownership over the rights, although they have been habiting in that place for generations. And they can be evicted without prior notice. And the compensation is only for loss of fruit and rubber trees only. which I find it very strange because in a forest, there is no rubber trees. So rubber trees comes under secondary forest and secondary plantations, And Section 12 says state authority may pay compensation. So it is not obligatory. And I mentioned to you just now that land is a state matter. Now, if you compare that with the non-Aboriginal community people, the Land Acquisition Act, acquisition is based on fair and adequate compensation. Now, you don't see those words worded in the Aboriginal Peoples Act. Although Article 8 of the Federal Constitution says everyone is equal, everyone should be treated equally, but the Aboriginal people and the others are not treated equally on this point. Section 19, subsection 1 and subsection 2 is a very shocking provision because it vests total power in the minister to protect, control, and otherwise decide issues concerning Aboriginal community. And the commissioner shall be responsible for the general administration. This completely shows that the relationship is asymmetrical. It's a top-down approach. It is the government which decides what is right and what is not. And there is no consultation done at all. And that takes us to another area regarding environmental justice, which I'm going to talk about it in another seminar next month in Sydney. But for this now, I can say that there is no symmetrical relationship. There is no dialogue session between the Aboriginal community and the authorities. So if you look at the preamble of the Aboriginal Peoples Act, it says, provide for the protection, well-being, and advancement. But this provision do not act in tandem with the preamble. Then the cases, we have cases since 1991, Justice Abdul Malik in Kijang Amas, irrespective of whether the area had been gazetted as Aboriginal land, all resources rightfully belong to them. Now, this is a good point in spite of what was written in Section 6, subsection 3. And another case by the Mokhtar Sidin at the Court of Appeal, compensation for crops grown, but it is not for the land acquired. So the right to live on land as their forefathers have lived, even future generations. So some of these cases are quite welcoming, quite a good decision. And of course, the landmark case, the case of Sagong Tasi, native title, which is recognized under common law. They brought in common law because there is no ownership under Aboriginal Peoples Act. And common law applies in Malaysia. And the court went on further to talk about that the compensation should be based on Article 13 and a land acquisition. And this is a welcome decision because it treats the Aboriginal community the same as the others. And certainly the Aboriginal Peoples Act, Section 11 and 12 is ultra vires, and the 14 days notice is unreasonable. And the court actually used the term fiduciary duty. I will explain that provision afterwards when we talk about Article 85. So some of the reforms which should be or can be thought of is whatever land which has been acquired from the Aboriginal community should be returned where it's possible, or offer an alternative suitable land, have a dialogue session. Section 19.1 and 19 subsection 2 just now just doesn't make sense. Do give adequate and fair compensation, but of course the problem is, how do you calculate cultural loss? How do you calculate the loss of what do you call ancestral land? If the government is so worried about giving individual ownership, perhaps what the government can do, the state, I mean, to grant communal land ownership with a caveat that the right to transfer ownership should be only among the Aboriginal community if there is a fear that land will be transferred to some other community. There must be some form of a committee to look into these land grievances. Perhaps there must be an Aboriginal land tribunal. There is a native court in the east of Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, but we do not have an Aboriginal land tribunal or court in Peninsular Malaysia. And Article 85C of the Federal Constitution, which is very interesting because it provides for the protection, well-being, or advancement of the community. So perhaps what the federal government can do is to acquire land for federal purposes under Article 83, because the 9th schedule list gives them the rights, and then take care of the rights of the Aboriginal community. And of course, the best thing will be to repeal the Aboriginal Peoples Act. It's quite a tall order for me to suggest that there should be a special agreement between the king and the Aboriginal community, something similar to the Treaty of Waitangi, New Zealand, and to recognize the rights of the Aboriginal. And my last point is to recognize the Aboriginal community as the forefathers of this land. I know some of my colleagues in Australia, every single time when they begin a talk, they will always recognize the Aboriginal, the forefathers of the land. And I think for me to propose that in Malaysia could be a tall order, but we have to begin from somewhere. My concluding remarks will be that the Aboriginal People Act, it does not grant adequate legal rights to the community, as we can see from Section 6.3 and 11 and 12. The Parliament has certainly failed to protect. And the judiciary, yes, we have some cases, good cases, but the point is it has to be consistent in order to address the drawbacks by the Aboriginal Peoples Act. Otherwise, the community will continue to be vulnerable in spite of all the policies developed by the federal government. It is not going to serve any purpose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was wonderful on a very important topic here. Let's see. We have time for a quick question or two. So I'll just read these out loud. How effective have Aboriginal movements and acts of civil disobedience, as opposed to legal and legislative battles within the Malaysian state, been in shutting down government land theft? Have there been successful episodes that did not depend on arguing one's case in the state?
So what has happened is some of the NGOs are making their voices heard, but I can show you one incident where the Aboriginal community got so frustrated that they felt that they are going nowhere, and they actually built barricades to deter people from entering their area, the Aboriginal area. And that was completely interpreted as the Aboriginal community becoming violent and taking law into their hands. So we are still very much at an infancy stage on this point.
And then a second question says, there's recent news on amendments of the Aboriginal Peoples Act of 1954, which were said to be completed in 2025. Do you think this coming election might be a good time to push for accelerating the amendments?
We've been talking about this since 1983, actually, about what you call amending the Aboriginal Peoples Act, or rather repealing it. Not sure whether we will see any light at the end of the tunnel, but we can only hope.
And then one final quick question. Is there any interest on revamping the list of animals allowed to be hunted by Orang Asli, as currently there are only 10 species that they can hunt for self-consumption? Do you have thoughts on that?
One more time.
Is there any interest on revamping the list of animals allowed to be hunted by the Orang Asli, as currently there are only 10 species allowed? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have no thoughts on that yet, but I will definitely look into it. I know these are some of the special privileges given to the Orang Asli on this, but I don't have further thoughts on that. My apologies on that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks again for a really fascinating presentation. Let's go ahead and move on. So next we have Rosemary Giano from Keene State College talking about her work among the Semilai. Rosemary, are you there and able to share your screen?
Yes.
Excellent.
Did I do that?
It doesn't seem like quite yet. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and then yeah, if you make it larger, that would be okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Rosemary Giano, and this is my paper on government-imposed settlement, the Semilai and Asian Arowana at Tasabra, and a tragedy of the commons is what I'm asking about here. I'm starting with a map, or actually three, to give you some idea of where we are, and then we'll introduce the Semilai. The map on the right actually shows the distribution of Orang Asli, and the Semilai are right here toward the south. The Semilai speak an Mon Khmer language, but culturally have been considered Proto-Malays. They are somewhat different from the Orang Asli further to the north, generally speaking, in that way. The topography on the left side shows that they live in a very low-lying area, even though it's right in the middle of the peninsula. Very swampy. It's actually the part of, I think, the part of the peninsula that was the last really known by ethnographers because of its difficult terrain. And you can see in the middle map kind of why it was so difficult. The Tasabra, which is the largest lake in Peninsular Malaysia, is extremely intricate and a difficult, challenging environment that the Semilai negotiated very skillfully, adapting to its uniquenesses. The photo on the right side was taken in 1980 and demonstrates what I was just saying. The Semilai had a wonderful adaptation to the swamp forests, swamp rushes, and open water of Tasabra. Even though you could see that it's quite a sprawling lake, only about 1% of the lake is open water. And the Semilai, in addition to their use of water resources, were also fantastic Swidden agriculturalists, forest collectors. I went there originally to study resin collecting and trade, hunting. They have a very elaborate culture. The picture on the right I actually took about a month ago. I was there for about a month. And there are some Semilai who are still doing many of the things that they were doing back in 1980 when I first went there. But there are a lot of others who are not doing that, or not doing it as much, and instead doing, rubber tapping, getting jobs at Genting Highlands, getting degrees at the University of Malaya, getting PhDs in anthropology, as are other Orang Asli. And so Scleropages formosus, also known as Tinkalasa in Semilai, Kalasa in Malay, Arowana in English. Since the 1980s, there was a prophet, since the 1970s, there have been some Malaysian Chinese following a prophet at the time that feel that this particular fish species, which is extremely ancient, and most of the others of its related species went extinct long ago, but this one had survived, was seen as lucky, and so the price for this fish went way up. And the Semilai have always been very sensitive and conscious of the market for different things that they could collect from their environment, and so began night fishing for it. And they were not the only ones. I mean, this was true throughout Peninsula Malaysia, and consequently, that particular species was depleted, and eventually it became illegal to sell it in Malaysia. In 1990, I characterized this as a tragedy of the commons, but would like to take this opportunity to revisit that issue. So, tragedy of the commons. Since Garrett Hardin's article in Science, 1968, the expression the tragedy of the commons has come to symbolize the degradation of the environment to be expected whenever many individuals driven by their own self-interest and contrary to the common good have open access to a scarce resource. As Yogas has argued, many regard Hardin's tragedy of the commons as a neoliberal tool to grab lands in favor of private ownership. Ostrom and others have shown that the commons, when managed by empowered local communities, is not necessarily tragic, but triumphant in many ways. So I'm moving with that in mind, that perspective here. In fact, the original system developed by the Semilai to manage resources at Tasabra included elements of both the commons and of private ownership. I also want to argue that to the extent that the Arawana depletion was a tragedy of the commons, it was because of an unregulated commons. It was because an unregulated commons had been imposed upon the Semilai by governmental forces. And this is something that I emphasized in the original discussion, but I want to re-emphasize here. So I want to move to an oral history I collected in 1981 from, I recorded from Sahat Sipin that has to do with Semilai migration into Tasabra. At first, the Tumut were here. They told us, the Semilai people, about a place upstream, abundant with all kinds of fish and turtles. Fishing was easy, they said. So Semilais decided to go up there. This was not that long ago. Yes, not very long ago. And so these ancestors of Sahat and others there at Tasabra, grandfathers or great-grandfathers, came here from downstream, from the north, into Tasabra, or tried to, and brought along all their best incenses in order to connect with the local spirits, the spirits that governed Tasabra. And he mentions each of these. As they approached Lubul Kruing, which is the largest and considered the central open water at Tasabra, the wind started to blow. And so they turned around and went back. No, they couldn't come in that month. The next month they tried again, but no. Whenever they tried, no, it was like that. But eventually they managed to enter. And then after that, Tuaki Misai, the grandfather mustache, built a house in a particular area of the lake, and the other man also, and others followed them. Many people came into the lake area, settling everywhere. And so you can see in the story the connection being made and encoded of particular people, particular families, and particular locations around this riverine swamp. And then he emphasizes it was recently, really, that we came into this area together. This is Sahat. So he this, based upon this oral history, Semilais experienced Tasabra as a gift of resources governed by the spirits. Sahat makes it clear that Semilai had relatively recently moved into Tasabra and that they found there a paradise of abundance. Semilai have mentioned catching tapa, which is the largest kind of catfish, the size of deer. Semilai fishing methods included line fishing, fish trapping, fish weirs, and poison fishing. Poison fishing in Semilai is called kru or ka'ru. among the different methods of fishing that they use, it was poison fishing that was seen to need regulation. Poison fishing is an ancient method of fishing in Southeast Asia and elsewhere that uses the roots of Derris species, a domesticated vine. The Semilai cultivate this vine, and when preparing to ka'aru, pull out the roots, and then at the fishing site, they beat the roots and then wring the root fibers into the water. The roots contain rotenone, which stuns the fish and brings them to the surface. So the institution dedicated to regulating poison fishing is the Tuhan Dak or Tuhan Lubuk, which can be translated as water lord. The Semilai conceive of the lake and its tributaries as strings of named pools of water, mostly called lubuk. And I think in Malay you have lubuk, which are similar, I think, in concept. Each lubuk belonged to those living on its shores. Those people who became the Tuhan Dak or Tuhan Lubuk were the owners or lord of the water. And because resources were abundant, while the human population was still very sparse, the Tuan Dak's power primarily centered upon poison fishing. To poison fish in a lubuk, one needed the Tuhan Lubuk's permission. Those violating this rule could be fined. Tuhan Dak hosted ka'aru festivals, inviting everyone to participate. So these were important social events, and you could have 100 people involved or more. I actually was there a few years ago when they had this, and I took all these pictures and so on. And then there was a big storm, and my camera and the film got wet, and I don't have any pictures for that occasion, which is too bad. But anyway, it was a big event, and if you're interested in how it all plays out and much more, Zanisa Man's dissertation, Semilai Connections to Land, has a wonderful discussion of all of this. And Zanisa is a Semilai, by the way. So, you know, you can view this, I think, in general, and I've just given very sketchy information here because of the time constraints. You know, the Semilai combined incipient private ownership with communal access to fish resources and water resources. This rule about getting permission, though, had a proviso, which is interesting. The Tuhan Lubuk's power was somewhat undercut. If someone poisoned fish without receiving permission from the Tuan Lubuk, and the Tuan Lubuk complained to the chief, the violator would be fined a significant sum of money, but then was entitled to become the Tuan Lubuk. And this is a quote from 2018. We poison fish. It has been our place since the beginning. All of a sudden, there is someone who wants it. They want to poison fish there. There was no request. They did not ask the owner of the lubuk. This is in regard to one particular instance from the 1950s, I think. They did not ask the owner of the lubuk beforehand if they could use it. Certainly that is wrong. If I find them, certainly whenever I find them, it will be paid by the one who poisoned fish there. That means that it won't belong to me anymore. That's the way people do it. It remains, if perhaps we just want to get angry there, we can say what we want, meaning that anything we say, we're willing to say against them, people who took from friends. If we find them, sell to the one who poisoned fish there, the more they pay, the more it doesn't belong to us anymore. They become the ones with the property rights. Therefore, from my point of view, I don't want this to happen to my place. So the Semilai had a system for organizing this. Usually people didn't violate these rules. And usually if they did, the owner didn't necessarily try to get the Batin to enforce this rule. But during the Malayan emergency, the British colonial government, to prevent communist insurgents from obtaining food from Somalis, had forced population concentration and nucleation in two areas, one at Fort Iskandar, which is now Post Iskandar, and the other at Bukit Ro. And this is the area where people were concentrated and have continued to be concentrated, and basically depopulating all the other parts of the system. This caused an imbalance in population. People were over-concentrated in the Lubuk near Post Iskandar, while at other sections of the lake, Tuan Lubuk, were usually not on site. By the time Asian arowana became a hot item, the institution of Tuan Lubuk or Tuan Dak had been weakened by the settlement of most Somalai in the Post Iskandar area and by the lack of protocol for that kind of fishing. In 1982, when I was there, the Tuan of Lubuk Kruing did attempt to prohibit others from fishing for Arawan there, but I'm not sure how that played out. And as I mentioned before, fishing arowana is now illegal. After Malaysian independence, and even before that, the government continued as the overarching authority and continued its policy of settlement nucleation. The government did very little, has done very little to enforce sustainable practices. And it's disempowered the Somalai, so they haven't been able to use their own institutions and develop them. Somalais have gone and repossessed some of the areas of the lake and are protective of those areas. This visit I just made recently, I found out that water leeches have infested the lake. And so children don't go playing in the water anymore, which is, people have sort of moved away from the Tasabra being the focus of their lives in a lot of ways there, and the thoroughfare that got them from one, settlement to the other. And of course, as has been discussed already, the Somalai have no land title there, and it has not been gazetted as Orang Asli land. So there is not a lot of good news here, except that the Somalai have been pretty resourceful at finding other ways to make a living. Not to mention the fact that much of the rainforest surrounding the watershed of Tasabra has been converted to oil palm and rubber plantations, or rubber lots for many of the Somalai. So in terms of rules governing common pool resources at Tasabra, systems of common pool resources are not necessarily unsustainable. If given time and coordination, they may be more sensitive to local conditions and preferable to privatization or governmental authority. Somalais were unprepared for the remarkable abundance they found when first moving into Tasabra. And I have to say that one reason they were moving into Tasabra is because they were being pushed up river by Malays and by European, British development downstream from where they had been before. So that at the same time, they knew that they needed to be in accord with the spirit lords of the land and water. The sudden rise in demand for Tungkulasa in the 1970s strained the customary rules that had been developed by the Somalai to manage the lake's resources. This was exacerbated by their forced settlement and nucleation and by governmental agencies becoming overarching authorities while withholding title to the land and water. In essence, Somalais were not given the opportunity to self-determine the best course of action for sustainable use of Tasabra's resources. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks very much, Rosemary. It's great to hear this long-term perspective based on your work there, and these common pool resources are clearly vital. We do have one interesting question in the chat, even though we're a little behind. Let's take a look at it. For a common resource regime to work, the communities accessing a scarce resource need dialogue and need to come up with rules to regulate its use. Did you observe this happen among the Semilai with the arowana once it became a valuable resource and more scarce?
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear the beginning.
Basically, communities accessing scarce resources need a dialogue and need to come up with rules to regulate the use of it.
Yes.
Did you ever observe this happen in your work?
Yes. They were talking about this all the time. And there was a lot of controversy in regard to what were the proper ways to attempt to control and regulate use of resources. But, as I was saying, the settlement pattern initially was very sparse. There was just much more there than people could possibly exploit. And so the necessity for strict rules wasn't that great. And by the time there was this concern, some of the ability to oversee what was going on because that's part of having communal resources, to be able to police effectively, to make sure that everyone is following the rules as were set by everyone. And that was very difficult to enforce, given that not everybody was near the area where they were primarily concerned.
Okay, great. Ivan, you have just a quick question, and then we'll move on, or comment?
Sure, thanks, Vivek. Yeah, thanks so much, Rosemary. That was really fascinating. I just have one question about this kind of conclusion slide here. In the first paragraph, you say systems of common pool resources are not necessarily unsustainable. I mean, from an anthropological perspective, surely that's quite clear, because, for many, many years, anthropologists have been highly critical of kind of Homo economicus models of selfish, rational actors coming in and greedily taking over areas. And this has been the whole criticism of Hardin's perspective. So I was a bit surprised by that there. And you say, if given time and coordination, surely people like the Semilai, Batek, other Orang Asli and indigenous people worldwide have been successfully managing their environments for a very, very long time. It's not like they need more time. They know what they're doing. And in cases where you do get over-exploitation by indigenous people of their environments, isn't that generally a consequence because they've been pushed into such small areas and everyone else is destroying everything around them? People like Anand Singh have written about this, this kind of frontier-like mentality where people are like, sod it, okay, everyone else is taking everything, we will join in and we will plunder, even if that goes against everything our ancestors have done. I just wondered if you could comment on that.
I think, Ostrom provides lots of examples of attempts at common pool resource sharing that didn't work out very well. It doesn't always work out very well if you don't have a way to police what's going on. So
who gives the examples? I missed the first word. Who gives these examples?
Eleanor Ostrom, she got a Nobel Prize or a major award for her work on common pool resources. And certainly, she counteracts Garrett Hardin's argument about the tragedy of the commons. But if there is not an agreed upon, all the users cannot come to an agreement on a way of ensuring that everybody is, that they have a system where people are getting to use the resources, but not overusing the resources. And, the problem is that the Semilai, even though they are Orang Asli and indigenous, they're very interested in making money. And they're very interested in they can be very competitive with each other. And so there needs to be structures in place for making sure that the resources, which initially were quite abundant, continue to be sustainable. And that's, I'm basically reporting what they were telling me and what I saw. And yes, it's true that they were being squeezed up into that area. And this was within a larger context of globalization and a ferocious kind of British development of an interior that was, very sparsely populated. And it just was a kind of fluke in a way that they stumbled into Tasabra, which had all of this, all these natural resources, and that had been not hardly exploited at all.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll need to move on to the next talk here. So next up is Jeffrey Benjamin of Nanyang Technological University. Welcome, Jeffrey. Are you able to share your screen?
Rosemary, can you?
Oh, yes, Rosemary has to remove hers, I think.
What do I, oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, you'll notice there's a slight change of title, which I hope to explain as I go along. Now, since I've only got 10 minutes or so, I actually counted 13 minutes when I tried this through earlier today. I'll have to rush through this material and I'll have to read it since it's tightly linked with my slides. This talk is extracted from a much longer work, which is slowly nearing completion. And this is my book with the main title, Between Isthmus and Islands, with a subtitle, An Anthropological History of the Malay World. Among the many other topics covered in the book, there are 2 chapters dealing with long-term interactions between the Austronesian and Austroasiatic language families in what is now the Malay world. I use the term Malay world rather narrowly. I don't cover the whole of Indonesia, but the area, southern Thailand, Malay Peninsula, parts of Sumatra, parts of Borneo. That's what I mean. In the linguistic portion of the work, I aim to show that linguistics can uncover findings about the past that cannot be discovered through any other approach. More practically, I hope the findings will help place the Orang Asli more centrally within Southeast Asia's history and have the benefit of showing that they've been around for a very long time indeed. I found that the investigation must actually extend beyond Malay and its predecessors within Austronesian and beyond Aslian within Austroasiatic, or as it's sometimes called, Mon Khmer. Among the wider connections, it's turned out that even the Moklenic and Chamic subgroups, that's Moklenic up there, and Chamic is here, with an outlier on Hainan, and also Achinese in northern Sumatra is also a Chamic language. So that even the Moklenic and Chamic subgroups of Austronesian were part of the story, even though they are now spoken out of contact with each other or with Aslian. Moklenic has turned out to be the top-level subgroup, a top-level subgroup within the recently revised Malayo-Polynesian division of Austronesian. Its ancestor probably arrived in the region around 3,500 years ago, which would place it at 1,000 years before the Malayo-Chamic languages reached the mainland from Borneo. Strangely, they moved from Borneo here, and not by migration. For some reason, the local Mon Khmer people who were already there adopted the Malayo-Chamic languages that had come in from Borneo. It's a complicated story. It's been well written up by others. And also some 1,500 years before Malay reached the peninsula from Sumatra here and ultimately from Borneo. Forget the old stories which are often repeated that Malay came down from southwest China down this way. It did not. It came from Borneo. I've no time today to go through the well-authenticated pre-Malay links between the peninsula and Austronesian Borneo. I won't go through it. That left loanwords in Aslian as demonstrated by Blagden well over 100 years ago. And it's been reworked since with some new data. Moken and its close relative Moklen, jointly classified as together as Moklenic, would formerly have been spoken much more widely than its current rather narrow distribution along the west, that's it there, along the west coast of southern Burma or Myanmar and Thailand would suggest. In the past, this would also have included the peninsula's eastern side as well here. The role of the Mokens, who still exist, they are until recently a boat-dwelling population, now they're a land-dwelling population, one of the sea nomadic peoples of Southeast Asia. Linguistically, they're not close to the Orang Laut of the Riau archipelago. Their language is, it's Austronesian, but it belongs to a different division. The role of the Moken people in the region's earlier history was important. Moken speakers were among the nomadic groups who infiltrated the ancient trading networks along the coast of the Andaman Sea, this area here, and beyond in the last millennium BCE, say roughly 2,500 years ago. For example, it's been shown that Moken has been in contact with a variety of other languages, including Chamic, which, as I already said, includes Achinese and also a language in Hainan, with Malay and its now extinct Austronesian predecessors in the peninsula, with Austroasiatic languages, including Aslian, which I'm coming to, but also Mon, Khmer, and Nicobarese. Nicobarese is an Austroasiatic language spoken just here on these islands. It is more than one language, it's a group of languages. The ancestral Aslian languages, and for those who are not familiar with this terminology, I just have to point out that linguists use the term Aslian to refer to the Austroasiatic languages of Peninsular Malaysia and southern Thailand. About 2/3 of the Orang Asli speak languages of that group. About 1/3 speak dialects of Malay, their own dialects of Malay. So it's the Austroasiatic ones I'm talking about. And the Batiks and the Somalis we've been hearing about already, they speak Aslian languages. So the ancestral Aslian languages had probably reached the peninsula from the north by around 4,000 years ago, give or take 500 years or more, either way. This is based on the work by Nicole Krusper and Nicholas Brunhult, who I see unfortunately are not here with us today unless they've joined after I took a peek at the list of participants. Now, that is an early enough date for Aslian speakers to have been already present when the ancestors of both Moklenic and Chamic later began moving into the mainland, as I've said, ultimately from Borneo and elsewhere in the islands, but once having got to mainland Southeast Asia, they would have found the pre-Aslian speakers already in that Isthmian area. As you can see from this colored map, the Austroasiatic languages are very strangely distributed. And what's more, the people who speak these languages look very different. The ones in India look different from the ones in most of Southeast Asia. And as we know, some of the Orang Asli also look rather different from lots of the other Orang Asli. So you can't link this directly or simply with any particular genomic pattern. Genomics tells us something about language shift, but it doesn't, it tells us that languages move by means which are much more complicated than simply migration. Now, what's this gap here? Clearly, Burmese came down later, split it up. Thai came down later and split it up. Vietnamese did the same, but Vietnamese is already an Austroasiatic language, which is why it's also marked on this map. And of course, Malay did the same in this area, came up. Those were late arrivals in terms of the time depth I'm talking about at the moment. This Munda maritime hypothesis has been suggested by two linguists, Rao and Sidwell, Paul Sidwell. They've recently proposed that the isthmus, this area here, was a key location of Austroasiatic linguistic differentiation between around 4,500 and 3,500 years ago. That would have made the isthmus, this area here, the geographical source not only of Aslian, which several writers have already suggested was the case. It's reasonable to assume that pre-Aslian would have been spoken in this area too. Nowadays, that's the northernmost bit of Aslian right there, some of what are the populations now called Mani in southern Thailand, but must have been spoken further north in the past because all the relatives of Aslian are spoken up there. So that would have made the isthmus the geographical source not only of Aslian, but also of Munda here. And Munda, there are two subdivisions of Munda and well over a dozen distinct languages, and also of Nicobarese down here. Reaching their current locations by sea as part of the emerging Indian Ocean trading network. So they would have been involved in this quite early on, probably from as early as 2,500 years ago. Now, I'm not able to prove any of what I'm saying today, but here are some of the sources I've been consulting. You can see that it's a pretty solid body of literature, and this is only a selection from it. There's a much bigger bibliography of this in the book I'm completing. Now, it's long been known that Aslian words can be found in Moken, but recent work has shown that Moken itself has left lexical traces in several other Southeast Asian languages. Moken must therefore have formerly been spoken more widely than along its present restricted location on the Isthmian west coast. A likely reason for this lexical exchange was suggested by Larish in his PhD thesis on the Moclenic languages, where he said, I'll quote, he said, "When land-based peoples such as Mon Khmers and Thais reached the sea, they probably had terminological gaps in ocean-related domains. Since Austronesian knowledge was absolutely notable in this area, Austronesian languages are an obvious source of borrowing." And I think we all know that the Austronesian languages spread primarily by maritime routes, all the way from Taiwan and down through the islands until they reach not only our part of the world here, Malaysia and so on, but way across the Indian Ocean all the way to Madagascar. Now, with that initial scene setting in mind, I'll now present a few pointers from among the evidence I've been investigating. Since I have too little time, you'll have to take it on trust, reinforced, I hope, by the list of some of the sources I've been using. Today, there are no Moken or Moklen speakers on the Isthmian or Peninsular East Coast, so not on this side, but we can reasonably assume they must have, those languages were probably spoken on that side too. The isthmus here is very narrow, and it's extremely unlikely that the languages will not also have been spoken on that side. And there are no Aslian languages spoken quite this far north today. So what I've just been saying may therefore seem rather far-fetched. However, the populations in question were not necessarily located so far apart in the past. I would go further and say they almost certainly were situated adjacent to each other in the past. Now, it's long been known that a series of portage-based trade routes, they're marked on both of these maps, formerly traversed the narrow Isthmian section of the peninsula, leading from the Gulf of Thailand on the east to the Andaman Sea coast. Now, these islands here are precisely where the Mokens live today. This is their home territory. These would necessarily have involved the populations living along those routes, which earlier would have included both Moken and Aslian speakers. Here are some of the emerging polities in early Southeast Asia, which would have been involved in some of this long distance trade between the Indian Ocean and ultimately the China area. Now, with regard to the maritime dimension, the Indonesian linguist Waruno Mahdi has demonstrated that the ancestral pre-Moken speakers, probably in the early first millennium CE, supplied distinctive lexical items to a wider range of languages than the present-day Mokens are currently in contact with. These languages, which have received Moken words, include Mon, Batak from North Sumatra, Malay, Javanese, Chinese, and Arabic, spoken by traders passing through the region. The items include, amongst lots of other things, but especially crop names and boat-linked or maritime vocabulary. Recent archaeological research by Berenice Bellina and her colleagues has confirmed the existence of maritime and transisthmian trade networks linking the Indian and Chinese seas from around 500 BCE. A few centuries later, this led then to the emergence of urbanized settlements. This is one which she has been investigating with colleagues, but some of these other ones are now being investigated too. And here are some of the artifacts that are being dug up. They're found on both sides. And indeed, some of these are also found as far away as the Philippines. So this trade network involves a wide range of population, or did so in the past. So there were also specialized manufacturing sites in the isthmus, which are only now coming under detailed investigation archaeologically. Any such developments would have involved not only the Moken and Aslian speakers already present in the isthmus, but also the Malayo-Chamic speakers on adjacent parts of the mainland, who by now had adopted languages that originated in Borneo. And sorry for putting it quite like that, but the people who now speak Cham, most of their ancestors are probably more Khmer speakers of the Bahnaric subfamily. It took very few Malayo-Chamic speakers from Borneo to implant their language by sociolinguistic processes we can only guess at, but it wasn't a big migration. It was language shift. Now, this would also account for the presence of Chamic items in the linguistic mix I'm about to describe, hence my title, Moklenic Chamic Aslian. So let's look at some of this evidence. I hope you can read this. Some of it is in phonetic, well, it's all in phonetic and phonemic transcription. That's the way I like to work. My final 3 slides, starting with this one, summarize the kind of linguistic evidence I've been examining. Now, I haven't yet presented much of this material to any relevant historical linguists. I don't do the historical reconstructions myself. I rely on other people, Gerard Difflot, Paul Sidwell in Austroasiatic, Robert Blust, who unfortunately died a few months ago, and several other people on the Austronesian side. Alec Adelar, for example, is another one. But I've tried to take a methodologically conservative approach and resist just making wild guesses. As to when these changes happened, a variety of different dates and mechanisms have been proposed for the linguistic separations involved. I have my own views on these, but the question does remain open. It's quite difficult to put dates to some of this yet. So that's Moklenic and Aslian, and my notes here give abbreviated accounts of the reasons why I specifically say these are from Moklen or Moklenic and not from any other Austronesian side. Some of them are quite significant. This one Sabat I'll talk about later, Puteo I'll talk about later and shortly, but some of them are really quite striking. And they are in particular words that do not turn up in the form in which they've ended up in Aslian in other Austronesian languages. They have the form in Aslian that they already have in Moken. And since Aslian is not Austronesian, they presumably are loanwords. Let me move on to Chamic evidence. Again, you can see some of you will recognize some very important words here like Gob, Kare. I'll talk about Kare, the thunder deity, shortly. So have a look at these while I'm just talking about this. The items here on this table strongly suggest, or maybe, sorry, there's a paragraph before this, regardless of when the Chamic languages spread from their homeland in southern Vietnam, it's known that Cham speakers proceeded along the coast of the peninsula on their way to northern Sumatra, where they became Achinese. In doing so, we can reasonably assume that they would have interacted with Aslian speakers, and there's good reason for thinking Aslian speakers formerly lived closer to the coast than they do now. The items on this table strongly suggest that a degree of Aslian to Cham bilingualism formerly existed in the peninsula. So I will end with some key examples here, looked at in slightly more detail. This word putel, which means king in Chamic, and it's found in this inscription, which incidentally is the earliest known sample of any Austronesian language. It's from around 400 CE, and it's in Cham, and it's found more or less in central Vietnam. Can we say there have been Chamic and or Morclenic loanwords into Aslian? This one looked very suspicious. Putel is one of the Northern Aslian words for spirit medium or shaman. There's that word. It's the same word clearly, but it means king in this early state inscription. But Morken, even today, has the descendants of this word. It's been reconstructed. The protoform is potau, meaning old people, elderly, and used to call a headman. Clearly, all these are the same word. I can't be sure that it's come from Chamic, or did it go from Chamic both to Aslian and Morken, or was it the other way around? I don't know, but clearly this is a loan word, and this has been a puzzling word for a long time in Aslian studies. What about Chamic to Aslian? In Temia and Northern Aslian, the thunder deity is known as Kare, which Phillips in his PhD thesis on Proto-Aslian gave a very similar reconstruction with the long vowel Kare. Now, Blast reconstructed in his Proto-Austronesian reconstruction this word Kari as meaning, this is Proto-Austronesian, including Taiwan, meaning word, speech, language, and some of the cognates of this word, especially in Taiwan and in the Philippines, some of its cognates include the meaning to emit a sound. Now, is Temia and Northern Aslian Jahai, for example, Kare, is it this word? Is it this Austronesian word? I think it clearly is. The meaning is right. It's not Austroasiatic. The Aslian version, however, clearly derives from Chamic because Proto-Austronesian final E becomes A only in Chamic. So if it had come from some other source, it would be not Kare in Aslian, it would be Kari, but it's Kare, and that implies very clearly that it's come from a Chamic source. Lastly, the Temia word sabat, which has similar words in other Aslian languages, this disease caused by eating the wrong food, tabooed food. This is an Austronesian loan, ultimately from Proto-Malayan, Malayo-Polynesian. Malayo-Polynesian means all the Austronesian languages outside of Taiwan. This word is not found in Taiwanese languages, but it's found elsewhere. And Blast reconstructed it as having the meaning convulsion or to be convulsed. Sawan, notice the W, that's important. Now, following Diffloff in an early paper of his and Phillips in his recent PhD, the Temia word sabat would actually have derived from an earlier saban. Final voiceless stops in Temia derived from final nasals. That's quite well established. So it would have arrived as in the form saban, not sawan, but saban with a B. Now, Mati, in a rather interesting paper, has shown that this Proto-Malayo-Polynesian form would have been reflected with a B in the middle only in Morken. That is the only branch of Austronesian that has that shift of awa becoming aba. And hence, if Temia and other Aslian languages have sabat, not sawan, they all say it's the same word as Malay sawan, but it obviously hasn't come from Malay. If they think it comes from Malay, they got that wrong. It's obviously come from some other source than Malay, and the only possible source it could come from elsewhere in Austronesian, it would have been Morken. Okay, I'll end with this point, except with to make a couple of general comments. This isn't really a conclusion. There's a lot more to be done, and I've got much more information on lots of other words too, but I just chose these three because they are really they stand out quite noticeably. But the issues are still open for further investigation. But I hope I've said enough to suggest that there's much more work to be done. And with the point I started with, that the linguistic approach can raise and solve problems of Orang Asli history that we wouldn't even be aware of unless we started looking at the linguistics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was very interesting. In the interest of time, because we have 2 presentations left, I think we'll move on to the next speakers. If anyone has questions for Jeffrey, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. So thank you again. So our next speaker is Wahyu Diansha. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly, from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Are you able to share your screen?
Yes, hello. I'll try sharing my screen.
Fantastic. Okay, looks good.
Can you
Thanks.
see? Okay.
Yep, all good.
All right. Can you hear my voice clearly?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Wahyu, and thank you for pronouncing that correctly. I'm joining you all today from East Java, Indonesia. And before I begin, I'd like to thank the Symposium Committee for bringing us all together in this wonderful forum. And to everyone here with us today, thank you for taking the time to join this session. I hope you're all doing great. And thank you to the previous speakers for such insightful talks. I'll be sharing the findings of the fieldwork that I carried out last year, which was part of my master's research project on sustainable forest management and indigenous people. Now, let me begin with the background that led to my interest in conducting this research. So forests contribute to economic growth, and to gain the most economic revenue, they are preferably managed by professionals and forestry experts for the most rational management. And sustainability under their management emphasizes the continued production of timber. This depicts a relationship between humans and nature as one seeking to be in control of and dominating over the other. And unfortunately, local forest-dependent communities have no place in such management because they are seen as non-experts. They are believed to not have the knowledge, the science, the tools, and the capability to calculate for the most rational management. Sadly, these communities often bear the cost of forest degradation and receive the least economic benefit, yet they have no say in how the forest should be managed. Instead of riches that trickle down from degraded forests, a series of environmental disasters are what these communities get. And in the context of Malaysia, the Orang Asli, who are the indigenous peoples of the Malay Peninsula, have resided in various ecological niches long before the advent of Malaysia as a country itself. And those who reside in forest ecosystems depend on the forest in countless ways. However, they have not been considered in Malaysia's forest management as well, and their forest-based lives often run counter to forestry and development projects, with their livelihoods and forest-based lives considered a hindrance to forestry. And development projects have also displaced these communities out of their ancestral forest lands, including where my university currently stands. The main problem that forms the basis of this research concerns the notion of sustainability that is limited to the sustained yield of timber. This has made the exclusion of forest-dependent communities like the Orang Asli from forest management. So to make the Orang Asli recognized as a vital part of sustainable forests and to acknowledge their worth, it is necessary to expand the logic of sustainability beyond merely sustaining production. So under the social ecological systems framework, sustainability is not just sustaining the forest without sustaining the people who depend on the forest for their well-being. Under this framework, sustainability is linked to the concept of resilience, of how systems can retain their basic functions after intervention, after management, and after change. So for instance, in managing the forest, the basic functions like providing various goods and services must be maintained. And in achieving this, Burks and colleagues have pointed out 4 key factors, one of which is the most influential for this study is to combine different types of knowledge for learning, because nature is not only more complex than we think, but it is more complex than we can think. So working together with many perspectives on the problem at hand is the best way to go. The Orang Asli who have been residing in forest ecosystems for generations should have a valuable knowledge about the forest, and to analyze their potential contribution to sustainable forest management, a case study design was employed. I stayed for a month at a Kampung Orang Asli in the state of Selangor near the Hulu Langat Forest Reserve. It is a kampung of the Orang Temuan ethnicity that is still engaged in forest-based livelihoods. And through participant observation and unstructured interviews, I got involved in their kerja kampung, which is their livelihoods, and their relationship with the forest was able to be captured. Their forest-based livelihoods that are governed by their worldview were analyzed for the potential of including this community in forest management. This is the location of the kampung on Google Earth. As we can see here that the kampung is located in densely forested areas with a lot of tree cover around the kampung. And during my 4-week stay in the kampung, I observed and experienced how the community and the land are intertwined in a relationship that allows knowledge and beliefs about the local environment to foster. It is manifested in the kerja kampung, which is not just livelihoods that is confined to the physical boundaries of the kampung, but it is also culturally signify themselves as an Orang Asli. The findings of my study indicate that the kerja kampung and sustainable forest do not contradict, because kerja kampung does not simplify forest ecosystems by putting pressure on a single species. The forest biodiversity is therefore still maintained. Kerja kampung acts as a small-scale disturbance to the forest ecosystem, which is needed to ensure resilience according to Burks and Folk. On the other hand, too much disturbance to a system may lead to the loss of resilience. So maintaining biodiversity is key in maintaining resilience of ecological systems. Furthermore, in Malaysia, where the majority of the populations are Muslims, wild boar populations have become a concern. Overpopulation of wild boars may disrupt the forest ecosystem, and the Orang Asli here can play important roles in keeping the wild boar population in check. And because of their proximity to the resource, management can be more effective because the impacts of management will directly affect their lives. Involving the Orang Asli's kerja kampung can also promote more inclusive decision-making, and it shouldn't be seen as introducing new players to what already exists, but instead be understood as creating space for new possibilities. Sorry. These are some cases where I got the chance to get involved in the kerja kampung. And on the left here are the regular livelihoods, which they do regularly if the conditions allow, such as weather conditions, or in the case of wild boar trapping in picture C here, they had to take some months off due to Malaysia's movement control restrictions because they set the snare traps in the neighboring state, in the state of Negeri Sembilan. So I came with them multiple times here to participate, observe, and also learn about what they do. And on the right side here, the one-time encounters I had with the erratic livelihoods. So if there happens to be supply and demand, they will go to the forest and collect for, like, for instance, on picture D here is honey produced from the stingless bee species, or they call it madu kelulut. There are, of course, differences between the Orang Asli's ways of knowing and science, but we should not see these differences as a hindrance to collaborate in forest management. For instance, the Orang Asli's reliance on seasonal harvest requires them to be sensitive about weather patterns. And in the case of the annual durian harvest season, they have noticed a wind which they call angin lengwi. they say that the wind comes around January to March, and at the time of this wind, the durian trees will start flowering and honeybees will start producing honey. So every year they look forward to this Angan Lengwi to expect the honey harvest season as well as the durian harvest seasons. On the other hand, as I look further into the case from a scientific lens, it turns out that the ecological process is much more complex than that. The Orang Asli, of course, do not need this complicated explanation, but what they need is simple but accurate observations. Similarly, in the case of wild boar snaring, at first I was confused about how can they ensure the sustainable harvest of wild boars, because they never count how many boars they collect in a single year. After multiple encounters with them, as I followed them setting snares and asking them questions and observing how they process the meat, I noticed that they always cut the animal's chest right above the sternum to check the fat content of the animal, and they always do that after a catch. And it turned out that they only need to check the animal's fat content to ensure that the area has a healthy wild boar population. So they don't need to count how many boars they have captured in a single year to ensure its sustainable harvest. They just need to check the quality of the fat content, and that's enough to assess whether the snaring ground or the location has a healthy wild boar population, so they can set snares again in the next week and in the next snaring session. So the differences between the approaches of indigenous people and science should be like the two vessels metaphor coined by Stevenson, where each moves hand in hand towards the same direction for sustainable forests without having to control and dictate each other's vessel. On the other hand, there are some hindering conditions towards sustainable forests, which I found in the research area. With no secure rights to the forest, sustainability cannot be guaranteed because the forest can be claimed for other land uses, for other development projects in the future. And because the Orang Asli is not involved in sustainable forest management, we cannot assess how much pressure or how much disturbance they have made in the forest to ensure its resilience and vitality. For instance, last month, I got invited to the kampung for a wedding ceremony, and one man told me about his concerns that their honey harvest season might have disrupted the flowering of durian trees because the neighboring villages have already harvested the durians. Meanwhile, in Kampung Tanjung Rambai, the durians have not even bloomed and have not even bear fruits. He thought that maybe excessive honey harvest has disrupted the durian trees. So by involving the community in sustainable forest management, environmental conditions can be maintained to ensure their well-being and livelihoods of the people. And because of the social, cultural, and economic aspects are not well integrated with their exclusion in forest management, the Orang Asli is prone to be exploited by outsiders who use these people who have the privilege to collect forest products like wild boars and other things, where other groups like the Malays and the Chinese do not have the privilege to do. They tell the Orang Asli to look for certain animals in the forest for their benefit. So this is something that should be considered. The implication of the findings are therefore sustaining the forest cannot be separated from maintaining the Orang Asli's culture, because they form together as a social ecological system that has a long history of interdependency. The forest has been shaped by the livelihoods and by the cultures of the Orang Asli, and the Orang Asli themselves have been shaped by the forest conditions. By inviting the Orang Asli into the discussing table, into the negotiating table in sustainable forest management, the synergy between forestry and Orang Asli development can be devised for a more integrated social ecological systems. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That was great. Let's see if we have any questions or comments here. Okay, we have a question from Ben Mock, who says, thanks for the fascinating talk. In your example of checking the fat of a caught boar, could you elaborate a little on that correlation? Is it that a boar with less fat is correlated with more animals in the area having to share the same food? So more fat equals fewer boars equals fewer should be hunted in order to maintain the boar population? Or is it something else? Is this observation also shared among outsiders using a quote unquote scientific lens like biologists?
Okay, so at first they could not explain why they check the fat content of the wild boars, but after I looked into other indigenous peoples around the world who hunt bears, who hunt other animals, they also do the same thing. And then I asked back to them, does checking the fat content of the animal imply that if the more fat content the animal have, it means that there are plenty of food source in a given area, so you don't need to venture too far into the forest? And is there anything else that they might be able to explain with that fat content? They said that yes, because the more fat content in an animal tells the people that there is more food in the area, and it tells the hunters that the population is healthy, because the fatter the animal, it means that their reproduction is also good, which makes them settled at a given area for their snaring ground. They don't move to other snaring ground as long as the fat content of the animal is good, is satisfactory according to them.
Thanks, that's a great topic. Okay, let's move on to our final talk here. We can come back during discussion. So our final talk is about Orang Asli children and education, presented by Hima Lechamanan and Noor Soraya Abdullah. I apologize if I didn't get those names right. Are one or both of you ready to present, to share your screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see. Wayu, could you unshare your screen, please? Thank you very much. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Very good evening, everyone. So in this session, I'll be briefly talking about curriculum for Orang Asli children in Malaysia and the notion of fairness and what is included or excluded in the curriculum for Orang Asli children. This is a work that my colleague and I have been working on for the past 2 years, and it's an ongoing work that we're presenting. So just briefly to look at what school curriculum means, it's a description of what, why, how, and how well students should learn in an intentional and systematic manner. And the definitions of curriculum range from running a course, which comes from the Latin root word, to a more holistic, all-encompassing view that include all the learning experiences for which the school is responsible. And if you look at Scottish government in 2009, for example, the definition of curriculum that is given is the totality of experiences which are planned for children and young people through their education. And I'll come back to this definition in a bit. And moving on to the Orang Asli children and education for them, while much has been done to support their education in Malaysia, there's still gaps in their performance and achievement in schools compared to non-Orang Asli children. The school attendance is still a problem. there is high absenteeism rate among Orang Asli children. There is also a huge dropout rate, especially during the transition from primary to secondary education. And if one were to look at this absenteeism rate, it's also interesting to see how this absenteeism rate linked to the seasons, for example, and in different villages. So in Jandabaik, for example, with the Temuan children, there is a high absenteeism rate, especially during the ginger harvest season, where they would follow their parents to the ginger farms. Elsewhere, it would be in Kemensa, for example, another Temuan community that we've been working with, it's bamboo season. So there are these seasons where there is a period of time where students would not go to school, or there will be poorer attendance rate during this period of time. And in the recent years, there has been some studies done which point towards Orang Asli children's performance and education, or lack of, or has been affected, how their performance and education has been affected by lack of recognition in the school curriculum on their culture, history, and identity. And not fully recognizing the community's literacy experiences, for example, oral tradition has contributed to the language education in Malaysia, not adequately allowing Orang Asli children to engage in meaningful learning in schools. While that is said, there is also still a tendency in studies on education for Orang Asli children, and also media by and large, to articulate the problem of education among Orang Asli children as being situated in the children and in their communities. And an example would be an article like this. I'll just read it out because it might be a bit too small, where if you see the ones that I've highlighted in yellow, says that it is estimated that more than 10% of Orang Asli children have dropped out of school due to various factors, including logistics and family problems, in addition to their negative attitude towards education. And you would see such language written also by many researchers in studies on education and schooling among Orang Asli children, on negative attitude towards education, family problems. So these are some of the more negative languages used in discussing the educational issues, and failing to highlight the multifacetedness of the issue, and education for Orang Asli children, or of Orang Asli children. It's a complex, deep issue, and that, you know, and it's multifaceted. There are layers of problem, and simplifying it to just logistics or family problems or negative attitude portrays a negative image of Orang Asli people. And one can see this in a number of research done in Malaysia by researchers, and also in media. And so what we have been looking at is the issue of the notion of fairness in education, and relating it to curriculum, and how well the Orang Asli communities are represented in the education for in the curriculum. And the complexity, and in considering fairness in education for all children, the complexity of factors in a particular situation that both mediates and moderates the quality of education should be understood in a broader sense, and that's what we argued in our paper as well. And what the notion of fairness in education should include is the child's socio-demographic background, such as age, socioeconomic status of parents, socio-political situation that affects their access to education, factors that determine their accessibility to education, the kind of education they have access to as a result, such as their mental, physical status, geographical location, and language competency. In looking at curriculum and representation of Orang Asli in textbooks, for example, if one were to take a look at the textbooks that all children use in the public schools in Malaysia, we would see that there is very little representation of Orang Asli children or Asli people and their communities, and hence, when that happens, they feel excluded when they go to school. They feel their identity is not highlighted, it's not given any attention or importance in the classroom, and also ignored to a large extent, because the non-Orang Asli children, teachers are not aware of these of their cultural identities. So they are expected to learn about other people's culture and identity and historical context, but the same is not given for them. And the standardization of curriculum in Malaysia is probably one of the reasons for this. And while we think that there are important aspects of education, these are important aspects of education: standardization of curriculum, nationalization of education, as Malaysia being a relatively young developing nation, the focus of the curriculum has been on the needs of the average Malaysian child, which has then excluded children who may or may not be Malaysian and have specific or other or different needs. And when we look at this average Malaysian child, who they are the ones who conform to a particular social, economic, and intellectual standard expected by society. And so one would see that children who come from communities which are marginalized are usually excluded from the curriculum, or very little is mentioned in the curriculum to make any important sense in terms of their identity and representation. So that brings us to the quality education that we expect for Orang Asli children, and we see this as we've been seeing this for a very long time, but what I would like to highlight is especially what has been happening in the last couple of years during the pandemic, especially when schools were closed for, in total, schools were closed for more than 6 months, when Malaysia is one of the countries which had the longest number of days closed during the pandemic. And of course, there was a transition into online learning. But what it meant for Orang Asli children is that they were already behind. Many of them were already behind in terms of their performance in education, and moving into online made the gap wider, with digital divide, with resource divide, and other problems like having to assume adult responsibilities, such as doing household chores, taking care of younger siblings, helping parents, families, having to work because families are falling deeper into poverty, health being compromised. So there were a lot of these things which weren't taken into consideration. There was just a shift into online learning, and students were expected to resume learning via online quite seamlessly when there was a whole lot of other things happening on the ground. And with this, what happened is that when there was difficulty in catching up or joining this online learning, you'll see that a lot of these many children then just dropped out, and never returned to school once physical classes resumed, and there is very little evidence of how, or systematic studies done so far on how much this pandemic and online learning has affected Orang Asli children thus far. There have been some studies done with their struggles and all that, but whether they have returned to schools and how it has affected them, that is still something that I think we need to do more systematic studies. And so coming back to curriculum then, what a quality education, or what fairness in education would mean for Orang Asli children is that it could be a curriculum that speaks to their culture and identity, so that they can relate to the curriculum. Because there is, like I mentioned, there is a lack of inclusion of their culture, indigenous identities in the mainstream education. And the school curriculum plays an important role in ensuring an inclusive learning environment is created with the inclusion of Orang Asli cultural practices and norms, use of oral and visual in learning. Teacher education is another important factor, that teachers are not trained to teach children from different communities. And teacher education also, to by and large, focuses on teaching the average child that I mentioned earlier. And so when teachers are then sent to schools which have higher number of Orang Asli children, or children from other marginalized communities, they find it difficult to adapt. They find it difficult to include them or create an inclusive classroom for these children. And there is also lack of community and parents' involvement in the school. And all this, and these are just some of the examples. Like I said, it's a deep, complex, multifaceted problem, and due to constraint of time, I will not be going into the others. With that, I would like to end my presentation here and take questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you very much. Great presentation, and it definitely caused some discussion in the chat here. So if I might just summarize some of the points here. The question is, are there any differentiated, localized curriculum for Orang Asli children? And then Chuck Poe asked, what's wrong with setting snares versus going to school? I think what these points are getting at is something you yourself mentioned. There's a diversity of Orang Asli experiences around the peninsula, and what are children going to be doing in the future? How do they prepare for that? So how do you think about accommodating all of this diversity into a curriculum? You may also want to just peek at the chat, because there's more comments than I can get to. Is our curriculum what is now channeling workforce toward modern employment? If school curriculum targets livelihood strategies, we will have more contextualized learning. So there's many questions there, and I'll just leave it to you to sort of address that broadly. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just go back to the question on think I lost it. What was local environment should also be perceived as their school. I think what we were, our understanding of school is, of course, the physical structure, you know, where people actually go to school, and there is a standardized national curriculum that children learn. And if I think there was a question on whether there is a localized curriculum. For preschool, there have been some initiatives by communities in starting their early childhood centers with localized curriculum, but this is not mainstream, as in it's not implemented in all Orang Asli villages. There's only very few Orang Asli villages. By and large, the other Orang Asli children follow the national curriculum, be it for pre-primary, primary, or secondary curriculum. Not sure if there are other questions or just comments from people.
Yeah, there's a number of comments.
Without any questions.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we've somehow been here 2.5 hours now, so maybe we can use this as an opportunity to open things up more broadly for the next couple minutes before we call it a day. Is there anyone in the audience who might like to share an experience or a comment? I know Azdayanti has had some comments here. Maybe she would like to share, but not to put you on the spot or anything. Or perhaps May or Vivian. Okay, May has raised her hand. Are we able to get May to speak? If you unmute May, are you
Sure.
able to?
Just give me
Or
a
do we
second.
have to do it?
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead while we get May's thing worked out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm a little, okay, let's put it this way. We have to try to be less systematic in thinking about education. In just trying to find the best system that works for all Orang Asli children, it's not going to happen. I think that we should have a system, a very diverse system, where where parents can slot into different options that works for their children. And I don't like presentations like this one, because you seem to put a lot of the blame on Orang Asli children for not going to school, for preferring to collect ginger or something. So I think we need to be thinking more creatively.
I think maybe I can respond. Thank you very much for your observation. However, I think you've got the wrong end of the stick. What we actually were pointing out, that most of the studies that we had looked at, and many of the comments, maybe by social or educational commentators, seem to point the finger, or actually point the finger towards the Orang Asli. And that is why we felt that we needed to look at this issue much more closely, because people were misconstruing the idea or the problem, or pointing or laying the blame at the feet of the Orang Asli themselves. So actually that's where we're coming from, one. And then the second thing is, we're not really advocating, we're actually questioning education as it is, standardized curriculum, maintaining, using standards which are not culturally or individually defined. that's one of the issues that brought us to the question of what is justice, what is fairness in education. If we're going for quality education, shouldn't quality relate to who is the child here? Because it's a child that's very important. It's in fact not even the community. You shouldn't look at Orang Asli children as Orang Asli children, because if I may share, there was some researchers before us who actually talked to young women about their experience in schooling, and I remember being involved in the discussion with these young women. And I remember one young girl was talking about, I don't want you to see me as Orang Asli. I don't want you to see me as an Orang Asli child. I want you, meaning the teacher and other people, other students, to see her as an individual. And that's precisely what we're trying to uncover as or why we're looking at this issue of what is fair in education. So we actually coming from the perspective, because we're not sharing a whole paper, our whole assumptions that we're making, but actually we're coming to this issue from the perspective that it's not only, because most people will talk about fairness in education as access to education. But we also say that we should look at access to education and children's experience of the education, right? That includes who the child is themselves, where they come from, which community they're in. Which community is important because it will define some of their characteristics or character, but it's not necessarily all coming from the community itself, as this young girl mentioned, right? So she wanted to be seen in her own right, or understood in her own right. So that's also what we're trying to explore here, in order to see how we should understand fairness in education, right? So that's actually what we're trying to say. So we don't have enough time to actually articulate what we actually were thinking of, but I do believe Emma, my colleague here, did mention that, that these were the issues, right, that brought us to this. And so we're still looking into this idea of justice, but when into the idea of fairness. And one of the conclusions on reflection, we felt that the curriculum should be authentic, right? Or the authentic, well, for lack of another word, we found the word authentic quite close to what we meant, right? Authenticity should be a consideration. And that means, in other words, as my colleague mentioned just now, the problems are multifaceted. So we cannot approach it from one size fits all or a different size fits all. We need to maybe look further into that. But what is it and whether it can be done is another question, right? If we differentiate it, how are we going to train the teachers to differentiate every time, right? Use different languages. For example, the children may be more familiar with a certain language. Should we use different language? How are we going to prepare teachers to teach in different languages, right? Yeah. So there are a lot of issues there, but we're looking at this, the idea first, trying to unpack the idea of fairness.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I think there's probably more concordance in these views than maybe initially thought. Okay, so I think we have May available to speak, and this will be a good test to see if our audience members can talk. So May, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, speaking of education, I just wanted to share the perspective of one of my colleagues, who is Damya. His son, I think, is about almost entering primary school, 5 or 6, I think. And I was just talking to him, asking him what are the plans. And so he shared with me that him and other people in his village from Perak, where their kids are almost around school going age, and they were torn between sending their kids to local primary schools or a private church-run primary school, because they could see that kids who went to this private school came back being fluent in English, in Chinese, or they saw a difference in the kids, while the students, or maybe perhaps even they themselves who had attended government schools, didn't achieve the same level of learning and were also persuaded to embrace Islam among others, or made to attend multiple religious classes. Yeah, but they were aware that there are pros and cons for both options, because I don't know which group runs these schools, but I think they are not eligible to go into local university if they complete Form 5 O levels. Yeah, so they were in this situation where they're thinking, should I send my kids to a privately run school where they will get a better quality of education, or the national school system where they will get what we got? But the difference is that there's a chance of them furthering their studies. Yeah, so I just wanted to share that story. Hello.
Okay, thanks for that. Any responses from the last two speakers? Otherwise, we can just open it up more broadly.
Okay. No, I think I just want to respond again. I think maybe there was a misunderstanding. So when I mentioned about the school attendance, I was giving an example to to why there is a possible poor attendance, and it's not to assign deficit on Orang Asli. In fact, the entire presentation was exactly on that it shouldn't be assigning deficit on them. It should be looking at curriculum, and then there's a deeper problem than what the media and some of the research papers have been pointing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great. Okay. Well, and just in the last few minutes here, are there any other questions for any of the other panelists that people wanted to ask? Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, we have two raised hands. Tom, do you have a question or a comment? You should be allowed to talk now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
This is a question for Jeffrey Benjamin. I was wondering if there are other examples of language families around the world that look similar to the Austroasiatic distribution, as in how unique is the pattern that we see with this very broken up geographic distribution spoken in Southeast Asia and South Asia compared to other language families?
Yeah, interesting question. Southeast Asia has a great many languages, and I currently teach 4 courses in the linguistics department, NTU, on Southeast Asian linguistics, and this topic comes up quite a bit. But this basically happens where some languages get very big, they're supported by states, or they turn out to be very useful interlanguages, like Malay historically has been, and they tend to wipe out smaller local languages and sometimes leave hardly any trace of what was there before. Of course, this has happened in obviously Australia, North America, and so on, with English, in Africa with both English and French. Arabic has also wiped out traces of a lot of languages. So this isn't something in itself unusual, but Robert Blust did some work on this. He pointed out that for some reason, the middle of the Philippines has fewer languages in it than either the North or the South. Something must have happened there, but he's not sure what, to have allowed, even within the Philippines, the advancement of one particular group of languages and pushing away lots of others that were there before. So in itself, it's not a new phenomenon. What I wanted to emphasize, though, was that contrary to much popular view, languages don't necessarily, and in some cases not at all, spread by mass movements of population. In Southeast Asia, there has been a massive amount of language shift. It occurred with Munda. The Austroasiatic implant into India was only by a few people, but the locals took it up. The same with Chamik coming from Borneo and arriving in Vietnam. The Banaric speakers, their Khmer speakers, took it up, and there are quite a lot of other examples of this kind. So it's very difficult to reconstruct the ancient sociolinguistics lying behind some of these processes, but definitely something was going on to motivate shifts of this kind.
Great, thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Thanks for that. May, your hand is still up. I didn't know if that was a new hand raise or.
No, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know I
Just
have
making
to
sure.
unpick it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Well, now that we are coming up on 3 hours, I think we'll call it a day. Before we do that, I'll just note we're going to convene at the same time next week, which is 8 p.m. Malaysia time. And the topic next week is Orang Asli health, broadly speaking. We have 9 talks next week. That's 2 more than we had today. So we will need to be a little bit more strict on time. And I expect we'll probably go the full 3 hours so we can have some good discussion as well. I apologize if I didn't get to anyone's questions today, but hopefully by seeing the people who are in the audience, you have made some connections today that may prove to be fruitful. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week as well to continue this. Thank you very much, and we will see you then.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great job, everyone.
Vivek, can you stay on just for a minute after everyone leaves?
Yeah, can do.
Okay.